Hi, welcome to Nectar's panel on ritual and ceremony. I'm your host, Pascal Tremblay. I'm the co-founder of Nectar. We're a psychedelic support ecosystem. And today we're exploring ceremony and ritual. And ceremony and ritual means something different for everyone, but it can always be shared. And our intention today is to dive deeper with our guests into what ritual and ceremony mean to them personally and how it can help enrich our everyday lives and our integration of life's peak experiences. Nectar's tagline is "Every day is a ceremony," because I personally love the idea of approaching life that way. And I'm very much a student and a beginner when it comes to ritual and ceremony. I've had my own experiences with it, my own journeys with it. And yet there's so much richness and so much uniqueness to everyone's perspective on what it means to them and how they've experienced ritual and ceremony. And today I'm excited to meet up with three of my friends that are going to share their perspective on that. I'm going to be joined by Robin Clements and Meagan Sheldon and Jazmin Pirozek to explore these ideas. And Robin, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit? And what is your personal relationship to ritual and ceremony? What does it mean to
you. Thank you. Thank the three of you for joining me today. Life is ceremony. We are the medicine. I really didn't grow up with ceremony. I didn't grow up with elders around me in the Northwest. My father was a police officer when I was born, and I established a pretty strong authority complex. And it wasn't until I landed in Mexico where ceremony is very present and readily available to the culture in Mexico that I started to experience the sweat lodge, and eventually found that I was experiencing something very familiar that felt like home when I was learning to follow the ways of the circle, the way that the wind travels, the way that the sun moves through the sky, and how the circle and the traditional ways really follow those laws of nature. And so I've learned to implement those things into my life, and it's a joy to have children to share that with in ways that we can just slow down and connect in with the elements of nature, become the nature of the things around us. And I'll just share a quick story of our last sweat lodge. Someone was really touched to see my daughter, who's 5 years old, right on her own, just come up to the fire as the stones were being heated for the lodge, and she held some tobacco to her heart and just really beautifully and intentionally on her own offered some tobacco to the fire. And when someone asked her what she was praying for, and she just said, for thanks, that we all can give thanks. So that was a really strong reminder that our life has shaped itself around ritual and ceremony, and I'm really honored to be a part of the panel today. Thank you.
Beautiful. Love that share. Jazmin, how does ritual and ceremony show up in your life, or what's your relationship to it?
In my heart, ceremony is carried by each individual. And so for myself, when I see the needing to have a song to be able to calm the waters that we're in, that's always really helpful. And I think it just shows up just whenever. To me, ritual is it's more habit with intent, rather, where with ritual, it could be anything. It could be even bad things for us, like smoking all the time. Like I have a problem with that, smoking a little too much. And at least if you have a really clear intent, then your intention carries out in the rest of your life as well. For ceremony, many people ask me to not necessarily conduct a ceremony, but to hold a ceremony for them if they're emotionally taxed or if they need some just spiritual support. I offer that quite often. And ritual and ceremony together, every day we carry out ourselves in ceremony. And though it's the rituals, the habits with intent that carry us through. So even drinking a glass of water, my teacher in Peru, we were taught to blow on our water. And that's a sort of ritual, but it's a ceremony in and of itself as well. He told us to put black rocks, like really black rocks inside of our water, just to absorb all of the negative energies that could come across as well. So the ceremony is every single action that you take in your life, clearly. And those rituals help to keep us in that ceremony space. And it's always good to have a reminder, as Pascal, we were speaking about prior to this, that I busted out a song when we were in a meeting because I saw that the waters were just very rocky and that we just needed to calm them so that we could see clearly. That's the great thing about ceremony and ritual and ceremony together, is that we could just, it's there when you need it. And if you carry it in your heart, then you can express it when it's needed. Yeah, I think that's what I got.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing. Meagan, do you want to share?
Yeah. Like all of us, I imagine that we've been seeking ceremony most of our lives. I grew up in a secular family without a strong connection to my cultural roots. So I always felt like I didn't get access to ceremony and ritual. I felt like there was a big wall and it was on the other side of that wall. And there was definitely times in my life that I was craving it more than others, but none so much as during a heavy grief period. So my husband and I experienced 3 recurrent miscarriages while losing his father to ALS. And I think it was then that I not only saw my need for ceremony, but the ceremony-shaped hole in our culture. People didn't know how to be with us. They didn't know what to do. If they did things, it was usually uncomfortably. I started to really dig into the idea of grief and grief ritual. I became a life cycle celebrant. I became an end-of-life doula. I started stepping through the fire into the things that scared me and scared a lot of people, looking at death and dying through that lens, and really trying to reshape and shift the narrative about what it means to live and die with ritual and ceremony at our fingertips. So it's been a beautiful journey of discovery and unlearning and relearning, really trying to understand what the essential elements of ceremony are. My husband and I decided to take all of these learnings and build them into an app called Be Ceremonial, which is a place where we share these learnings and these tools and then empower and inspire people to create their own ceremonies. So it's really a DIY kind of approach with the guidance of a beautiful community that can share back our collective experiences and also really carve out our individual relationships with ritual and ceremony. So yeah, that's what we're up to.
Beautiful. I want to salute your courage for going through that fire and then transmuting that into offerings for others to connect more with ritual and ceremony. Thank you so much for that. What are ways that the science tells us things about ritual? They've actually done a lot of research on how ritual can help us with stress and anxiety and connection and performance in sports. It goes so much more than the health and science and things of that nature. How has ritual and ceremony helped you in your life to live a more connected, harmonious life?
I think that when I became a mother, there's a big narrative around self-care. I was a business owner, a mother, a friend, a partner. I was all these things. And the messages that I kept getting were like, just do more self-care. And so I really tried to create new self-care rituals and really try to take care of myself. And it was exhausting and isolating. And so once I added in the other element of community care, how do we care for each other within a self-care environment? I felt so much lighter. An example of that is I host a weekly swim in the ocean where people can gather and we choose an object on the beach that's representative of something that we're grieving, and we share it in circle and we witness each other. We've never met some of these people before, and they might share a big, heavy loss that they're walking with, or a smaller kind of micro grief that might be showing up in their day-to-day life. But we start to normalize this idea of sharing our load and not feeling like we're having to carry it on our own. We then go into the cold water and have our own experience and come out and share what we're going to carry forward from that day. And what I think it started to shift, not only for me, but the now hundreds of people that have come through these ceremonies with us, is that we are not alone, that these rituals that we create in our lives, if we keep them just to ourselves, that's wonderful. But the magic and transformation happens when we step into that community setting and look at how we can support each other as a wider kind of whole, as opposed to seeing it little pieces and parts. So yeah, I think it's been a real discovery for me of the simplicity of ritual, but also the complexity and a lot of baggage that people have to let go of and face because they have these preconceived notions of what it should be or what their own experiences in life. So it's been a beautiful journey, and it will continue to unfold in different ways. I think we're all still learning and we're remembering. I think that's a big part of this journey, is we're remembering how to be with ritual in our everyday life.
Can you talk a little bit more about the preconceptions that you've encountered around ritual and ceremony?
Yeah, I've had hundreds of people come through our ritual and ceremony trainings, mostly around end of life and grief. That tends to be where, that's usually the call that people realize that there's the gap, right? It's when they're living their day-to-day life, there might be a gap in ritual and ceremony, but they might not see it so much as when they come face to face with something that is so scary and traumatic and hard and heavy. So people come into this and there's two ideas. There's one is that they might not feel religious or spiritual, and so they don't think they can bring ritual and ceremony into their life if they're very scientific or very identify as a humanist. So coming that with the secular humanism values, I think people are unsure of where to start when it comes to that. And the other thing is that a lot of people have had negative experiences with ritual and ceremony, or they've seen it become performative. So if you think back to a lot of the weddings and funerals, and there's a place for performative ceremony and there's a place for tradition for sure. But I think we've often lost that intention. And Jazmin was speaking to that idea of bringing that intent into that space. So I think that people have seen it done all these different ways, and they don't really know how to go off script, and it feels a bit overwhelming. We also, for the most part, know ceremony from birth, marriage, and death. Those are the three typical experiences that people connect with ceremony. And so starting to let people see the seemingly invisible moments in life, receiving a cancer diagnosis, or getting divorced, or having a miscarriage, or getting fired from a job. There's all these changes in our life that deserve to be ritualized, and they deserve to be acknowledged. And yet, for the most part, our fast-moving culture just powers through. And you're selling your childhood home. Well, you've got a new home you're moving into. Don't focus on the past. Focus on the forward motion. And we forget to grieve. And those little griefs pile up. And I think that when something big like a death happens, all those little griefs that we haven't recognized along the way, they all come swirling up. So it's heavy work.
That was a real mouthful and really great, because we don't celebrate those really important times that actually shift who we are. Because I know marriage does, and death does, and birth does. But even, like you said, moving into a new home, like there's so much grief that piles up that we leave behind. My father passed away 13 years ago, and we had the whole ceremony, and it was a ritual, but we never carried it through. Every single year, it just keeps adding up for myself. A lot of this grief that I can't seem to let go of. And this year I decided that ritually, I put it into my Facebook that we were grieving, and that a lot of my family members are still grieving, and we never acknowledge it. We never spoke for my father when he died, because it was a very, I guess, Orthodox style ceremony. And it wasn't even in English. Like, it was very, we didn't get that closure. And that's what ceremony and ritual can bring us, is that sense of closure, so that we can keep moving, as Meagan was mentioning.
Thank you. I'd like to speak to how we're creatures of habit, and really appreciate what Meagan was offering there around how we've lost the power of ritual and the rites of passage. And the more time that I spend with First Nations peoples, there's a rite of passage for becoming a man or becoming a woman. There's a way of ritual when challenges come up. And I feel like we've really lost these powers of ritual, and how you're seeing that young kids have a tendency to create accidents or circumstances in order to live out some of the heavy tendencies, because we haven't had the opportunities to hold what they're going through in ceremony. And this is one of the qualities that I saw in Mexico, where the young people really did have access to going to Sweat Lodge consistently, and they were able to speak to what was going on for them. And there was an honoring of the rites of passage. And when Meagan was speaking to the weekly ritual of going in the cold water, that's a really powerful cyclical. Our life happens and moves in patterns of cycles and rhythms. So to create a healthy rhythm like that, to have a simple ritual like doing a yoga practice or dropping into some breathing every day, or just giving thanks, having a list of things that you're giving thanks for, as Jazmin's bringing in the power of intent. These are ways that we can start to shape our mind and our connection with our world. Instead of being overwhelmed by our thoughts, we're able to channel and integrate our life experience. And I think most of us have seen this disconnect in even some of the ceremonial medicine family cultures, where people are looking for the next heightened state of awareness. And there's a spiritual addiction of when's the next plant medicine ceremony. And anyone that's experienced a really good teaching from a power plant, they're shown how to implement some of those lessons into your daily life. And unless those lessons are implemented, they're going to come up for you again in a way that might be challenging. So really appreciating the reminder of these ancient ways of how we are habitual by nature, and just to create really good habits.
Beautiful. And Jazmin talked about closure, and Meagan talked about life's events and how we approach them. I'm curious around the significance of setting intentions before entering into meaningful events. Like, why do it? What does it create? What does it say about our relationship to life? Robin, do you want to share a little bit about intention?
Yeah, thank you. I've found that the intention could be like a GPS for the mind, that we can have a lot of racing thoughts, and we can have a whole list of things that we want to create. But if we get really organized and we use the power of self-inquiry to ask ourselves a powerful question, like, what is it that I want to feel more of, or what wants to be born in me today, or what would a miracle feel like? Our consciousness starts to organize around something that wants to happen for us. And if we organize that into a quality or a feeling or an intention, it gives orientation to the experience. And when we're in the ceremony, it's best to let go of that intent, to let go of the destiny, to be really in the present moment with the journey. But I feel like that's the most powerful quality of intention, is it gives some orientation and direction to our experience, whether we're going on a hike or we're dropping into a powerful potential peak experience.
Meagan, would you like to share a little bit about intention? And I'll share a little bit about I do daily ceremonies for myself, and I find that just the power of intention of doing almost anything just elevates the quality of the experience and the connection I have to myself and the world around me, to the point where I want to bring more ritual into my life. And I'd be ceremonial. You're creating rituals and ceremonies for people for all sorts of different events. And so I'm curious about the role of intention in those seemingly mundane things that we do every day, and how it relates together.
Yeah, I think the number one thing that I see time and time again when I meet with a person or a family or a community for the first time is that they want their ceremony to do too many things. They want it to bring people together. They want it to offer healing. They want it to be celebration. They want it to, they have this list of seemingly opposing things that can fit together. But my role as a celebrant and ceremonialist is to really get them to hone in on one word. Like, we really spend a lot of time, like, what do you want to feel when you're stepping into the ceremony, when you're within the containers of it? And as you leave, what are you going to carry with you for the rest of the day, the rest of the week? And that word becomes our guiding stone. It becomes that kind of, I love that, Robin, the GPS, like it becomes this true north that we will make our decisions based on that value, based on that intention. And what often happens is people come to me thinking they want one kind of ceremony. We get clear on the intention, and then they realize they need a completely different ceremony. They've come together perhaps to celebrate the end of a celebration of life after somebody has died. And when we get clear on the intention, which could be something like healing or, forgiveness, a celebration of life is not the right ceremonial setting for forgiveness. It has to be something more personal and private and contained. And then once you've had that healing ceremony or the forgiveness ceremony, you can step into a larger community celebration of life with the intention of that being to connect and gather. So I think that people often think that they only get one shot at it. They think that they have to, somebody dies or somebody's born or somebody moves houses, they think they have to just do one ceremony. And my invitation is to instead think about all the little micro ceremonies you can create around that event. So if I've had 4 sisters who were selling a childhood home, and they each wanted something completely different. And so I ended up working with them individually to create 4 small ceremonies. And then we got together in a larger setting, and each person shared their individual ceremony experience. And that became the larger ceremony that brought them together. But yeah, I think, like Robin was saying, getting really clear on that intent and why you're doing this is, you have to start there. If you start anywhere else, you're going to have to come back and rejig things after, because you'll have lost your way a little.
Jazmin, do you want to add anything about intention?
Intention's a powerful concept because we could think of it in 2 ways. We can think of it as it is the purpose and an intellectual kind of way in which we deliberate what it is that we are intending or wanting. Intent has even more power. I don't know if you hear my son screaming in the background. He knows we're part of ceremony right now. It's part of it. Intent has there's otherworldly powers behind intention. So as Robin was saying, we can have an intent and then we have to let it go, because it's going to do its work outside of us, outside of what our mind wants it to do. Like, we have our purposes, and usually that's how we express intent. But I always feel like intent has more power than we give it, because there's things outside of us. And that's the point of ceremony or any spiritual endeavor, is that we're trying to reach those powers that are outside of us, that work in spite of us, even work forward for things that we would want. But I always trust the universe, and I say the universe will decide what is best for this moment. But I put out my intention. Like, the universe knows what I would be intending. But there's this other power. I don't know how to describe. I'm I'm talking about necessarily as intent. And I think Robin mentioned this idea of the power plants, and it comes from those teachings too in Central America of intent and as an indescribable force that can move us forward even without our control or volition or anything. So I always want to ask people, like, what's your purpose? And then what's your intent? Because your intent will come directly from your heart. And when it comes directly from your heart and it matches with what's out in the world, then it manifests. So, and you know what? I was raised Christian, and I not just Christian, but Catholic. And so I went through numerous Catholic ceremonies, sacraments, to be able to understand a number of these things. And it's the ritual, fine, that's good. But really, what is the true intent? My father wanted me to go to reconciliation so that I'd understand how later in my life that I could let things go and that I could get beyond them. And that ceremony, even though it has a lot of dogmatic tradition that a lot of people do not side with, it still has that power of intent of letting go. There's still these purposes that are there. So I mention the intent portion because the Gospel of Thomas is a gospel that was thrown out of the Bible that I was never allowed to read. But it talks about how we intend and in how we can intend, therefore manifest. So if an intention comes from your heart, it can manifest out in the world. And I always like to think of it when I'm wishing, or however you want to look at it, when I'm hoping for an action. I always like to think it comes from my heart. So when I want something, like if you want to win the lottery or whatever, not a good example, but then you sing your intention. And that's how, I guess, the Great Spirit can hear me very well and clearly. And they can hear my intent with everything that's coming from my heart. So it's coming from my song. And that's why the song is so powerful. And that's the power of it. So I just wanted to go there when it comes to ceremony, ritual, and intent. I think that's important.
Mm-hmm. And it touches on a question I was going to ask next, which is, you've talked about connection to other forces and song and other worlds, and I've heard the word spirit a couple of times. I want to explore because so much of sort of our ailments as a society, I think, are symptoms of disconnection to ourselves and the web of life and spirit. And really, what is the role or the potential for ritual and ceremony to be a bridge to things outside of us, including Meagan when she talked about community? How does ritual and ceremony help connect with those things?
I'd like to touch on the power of handing it over to Creator. There's obviously something greater than each of us that's working and organizing and governing our lives. And we have a tendency to shroud ourselves in personal story and separate ourselves from the greatness of the One, which has many names. And yet, breath work, for example, which is the medicine that I share, is really cultivating our connection with this source of our life. And I find that people have a tendency to bring a lot of responsibility, and therefore there's a lot of weight on what we have to do to heal ourselves. And yet there's such a lightness when we can really just hand it over. And so learning the power of invocation, of calling in the unmanifest dimension of being. I'm not one that's gifted in a way that I can see the unmanifest dimension of being like some can, and maybe that's a blessing. But definitely have that experience of how easeful things can be and also how powerful. ceremony can get when we really hand it over to the forces that are working in the space. And I'll speak to that in that way.
I think for me, a challenge that I've had is that I'm not sure what I believe. And there's never been a kind of prescribed version of spirituality that I've been like, oh, that's it. That's exactly how I feel. I'm left with lots of questions and lots of doubt. And I think that the challenge in someone like me who isn't sure what else there is beyond is how do you then bring ritual and ceremony into that practice? And I think there's a lot of folks like me who fall in this in-between state of wanting to feel connected to the universe and the powers, and yet also have a lot of uncertainty and doubt around what lies beyond. I've been with a lot of people, before and after death, and I hope and I want and I wish for so many things, and yet I don't have any type of conviction around those beliefs. So for me, there's just this space. And somebody said it really beautifully that I trained with, that the thing that connects us all is this power of love. And whether it's love for something inside of yourself or for something that you see in someone else. I live in a beautiful part of the world. I have a forest in my backyard. I swim in the ocean almost daily. I connect with nature in that kind of glorious way of that transcendent experience. So I think really learning how to bring ritual and ceremony into a more secular setting has been a big challenge and an uphill battle. And yet it's really opened me up to so many wonderful people and questions. And yeah, I think that when I really get to the root of ritual, nature is the inspiration for all ritual. We look at the elements of earth and water and air and fire. We look at the sensory connections of what we smell and taste and hear. Jazmin was talking about song. I work with the Threshold Choir, this beautiful group of volunteers around the world who sing bedside when people are dying. And to have that song fill the space as someone is letting go and releasing, it affects every single person in the room. There's something that song does to bring us together. So for me, I'm left with a lot of curiosities and a lot of questions, and just the reminder that however we each build our own relationship with ritual and ceremony is to avoid that comparison of looking at what somebody else is doing, but also to be inspired and to keep searching for your own version of it.
Mm-hmm. It's that accessibility of ritual and ceremony, right? It can look different for everyone, but it can still be accessed wherever you are and whatever background you have. Jazmin, do you want to add about that piece?
Oh, so I will reiterate what Meagan was saying about how my husband's grandfather was passing away through medical assistance in dying, maybe 2017 or 2018. And the whole family is around in the hospital room, and the hospital, it's beautiful. It's on an island in Kenora. And so we can hear the water, we can see the trees. And I asked his grandmother if I could sing, just because it would make me feel better. And I wasn't necessarily trying to help everyone else, but I sang a song, and I sang a Spanish song in Spanish, an Icaro. And grandma said to me, and she's almost 90 now, so she's amazing. Said to me, nobody does that anymore. No one does it. And it's like Meagan was mentioning, the secularism. I was never really raised in a secular home. Like, my mother's Anishinaabe and my father was Ukrainian and very orthodox, very strict Ukrainian. So I was raised in the Catholic traditions and then had to learn my spiritual traditions, likely, I think, due to a lot of religious training. I went to school, to a Catholic school and everything, graduated in the Catholic school. So I was always immersed in these types of ceremonies. And I think what I really like about, say, acupuncture is that you don't need to believe in anything. I have no idea how that works. I have no clue, but it works. Same with ceremony. It doesn't matter if what you know or what you don't know, what you express, what you don't express. It always comes down to that tiny little thing of the intent. That's what I believe, is that if you have this intent, it can push you forward. So it doesn't matter if you have a spirituality or if you don't have a spirituality, or if you are just starting up your spirituality when you're 50s, that's totally perfect. I think everyone has that in their hearts, where they just not necessarily wish or hope, but they have that power of the intent. And I always like to go back there to that. And that actually comes from, is it Don Miguel Ruiz? And I've read all of his books, even the Carlos Castaneda books, but all these Toltec traditions are very similar to even living in a secular way or living in a spiritual way. So it doesn't matter who you are. We can have a ritual, we can have a habit with intent, and we can have a ceremony where we express our ritual, and then we can manifest. That's what we're all looking for. We're looking for that relief from grief, from that, our hearts celebrating and singing for the happiness of a new child. Especially, Meagan would understand, like, giving birth is in and of itself a ceremony. You don't have to believe in anything. You don't need to know anything. It helps, but nobody told me that it was like dying. No one told me that. And I think it's because you don't want to tell a new mother what that's like, where you feel like you're dying. You could be dying. You don't know. You're busy. You're very busy within the ceremony in and of itself. And I tried to listen to my ikaros and listen to my teacher sing, and I just didn't even have it. I couldn't, because we were just too in that moment, that one moment. So if you can have a ritual or a ceremony that you get completely immersed in, I think that is the most valuable thing. And I didn't know that until becoming a mother.
Robin, you're a father. Would you like to share a little bit about the ceremony of birth and having children with your lovely partner, Eden?
I'd like to speak to what I feel is coming up from the women here, our Western nature, and that we're programmed to live from the top down. We're very conceptual and mentally based, and how we're programmed in the West. And wholeness really lives in the body. Our whole intelligence lives in the body, not just in our head and our thoughts and our conceptual mind. And even religion has wrapped us up in the conceptual ways of how to pray. And in a way, we've disenchanted our ability to connect with the nature of things and to intrinsically become the nature of things. And like, even the Buddhist tradition reminds us that we're already Buddhas, whether we realize it or not. It's already the case, And so what the ladies are speaking to about intention and ritual really grounds us into what is already the case, which is the nature of things. And maybe that's the best definition of shamanism, is to become the nature of things. As far as your question of the ceremony of fatherhood, I've spoken to it a few times in podcasts, but I won't ever know the feeling or what it takes for a woman to bring life to the world. And I felt quite insignificant in that ceremony because of the power that it takes of bringing through that marathon for a woman. And yet I had a sister who reminded me that the father in the space is like the angel of the space. They're holding the peripheral energies of the container, and the woman's doing the work. And one of the beautiful invitations that I received on our wedding day from our ceremonialist, who is Lakota, who gave us a proper making of relation ceremony. He said to me, "It's time for you to step back in the circle and for your wife to step into the circle." And it reminded me many years ago when an elder said to me, "You've spoken enough. It's time to let the women speak." And it really feels like this is a time where the women and the feminine wisdom is carrying us forward. And it's not so much about how the male doctors are dominating a birth space, for example. It's really grounding back into the technology and the wisdom of what the women have been bringing for thousands of years, which is how they know to give birth. And so to remember how to pray with song has been one of the best forms of ritual for me, of taking me out of my mind. Of a midwife and a midwife are very different. A midwife tends to be very trained in what can go wrong medically in the space of giving birth. And a really good experienced midwife is really good at reminding a woman that it's safe to go there. You've got this. You can do this. And there's a very different quality to that. It's a difference between miracle consciousness and emergency consciousness. And so I feel like that has been some of the greatest initiation for me in experiencing the two birth ceremonies that we had at home, is really moving back into the prayerful space, like I was on Vision Quest on 4 days and 4 nights without food and water. You're reminded to pray for your people instead of going into your own suffering and pain. And the more you feel your own pain, the deeper you go into your prayer. And experiencing my wife going through so much pain brought me deeper into prayer. And I like to remind people what it feels like to pray for someone else. You know, when you're stuck in your own pain, and you pray for someone else, and you notice how that starts to change your own chemistry. When we witness an act of kindness, we have the same experience as when we're in an act of kindness, because the brain doesn't know the difference. The body's chemistry doesn't know the difference. We're just in the experience. And so we're upgrading our hormones and all those feel-good chemicals. So I feel like that is one of the most important things to share around birth, is that it's not an emergency until it is. And yet life gets challenging. And so how can we drop into gratitude and start to feel what we want to feel more of? And that's a challenge when fear comes in or uncertainty comes in. And birth, I think, has been the greatest ritual ceremony that has taught me that in the moment things can get really challenging. How can we drop in? Again, song, I think, has been the best way to use the spells of positivity to train my mind back into the antenna of God consciousness, if you will.
It's a good bridge to my next question, and thank you for sharing your experience of fatherhood. How can ceremonial practices enhance the experience of having a plant medicine journey or a life peak experience? My first interactions with ceremony was really an ayahuasca ceremony, and it was really the first time I really used the word ceremony. And so I've had these ceremonial experiences within the container of a plant medicine journey, and that's been extremely nourishing and enlightening for me to experience ceremony in that way. And that helped me bridge the idea of ceremony into my everyday life. So I'm curious from Jazmin, how can ceremonial practices enhance the journey, or what role does it play within that container?
The intent is always there of the person, say, who is conducting an ayahuasca ceremony, and you get to hear their intent through their song. And I think that's the strongest portion of a ceremony, and it brings everybody back to that medicine, whether it be psilocybin or any other psychedelic in general. Most of my experiences with Camerampi or ayahuasca, and the song is everything. And so that kind of is the pinpoint that holds you down or allows you to fly up. I think that's the most important portion of that part of ceremony for the heart. Even though somebody, like, you could be singing in ceremony and you could deliver your intentions that are good and pure and all of that, but you might connect with many other people in the room that would connect directly with that song and would hear and understand what your heart was singing and what your heart means, and then deliver it to other people that are around them. So it's infective. Like, you get to take that home with you. And I still remember songs from the first time I drank ayahuasca in 2013. And they always come back to me, and they're always there. Even though I may not have the words or understand, but I can still hear the tune. And I think that's the most powerful portion for me, is that it really connects with my heart. And that's why I mention intent the way I do, is because it comes in my mind. It comes from the heart region. That's where I'm thinking and feeling when it comes to a ceremonial space and comes to these psychedelic rituals in general. Now, I think that that's missing in a Western context, and I haven't really had a Western psychedelic in a Western kind of way, like ketamine or, mostly ketamine. I haven't really experienced it in that way and I just think it would be, in my heart, it would be absent.
It does. Thank you so much. Yes. And Robin, a piece of your facilitation and of the group container and the energy in the space. And in my experience, it's like what Jazmin said, which is really, it connects the field, and it allowed me to go a lot deeper because that container, that structure was there, and that intent was in there. Can you speak a bit more about ceremony as a breath work facilitator and trainer? Like, how did it come in for you as a facilitator? How do you navigate the ceremony of a training or a breath wave journey?
I feel like what you're speaking to is really about the container that's set, because when we open up the spiritual dimension of being, the veil gets very thin and we become this multidimensional nature that we are, and everything's not all love and light. We're doing shadow work when we're in ceremony, and so there's energies that can come in and really stir things up and start to wreak havoc in the space. The container that's set, as Jazmin was sharing, the songs that are sung are speaking to the plants. They're calling in the energies of the earth, or there's so many beautiful intentions and spells that come into the ways that we sing. But even the ritual of just eye gazing and sharing our breath, and how that intimacy of human connection in a breath training really creates the container of intimacy and safety for us to go deep. And when we call in the directions, we're not calling them in per se, we're calling ourselves into sacred space, because the directions are already there. We're just acknowledging that these beings that work with us are in these directional spaces, and we're bringing ourselves into awareness to co-create together that sacred container. And that really opens up another dimension of our experience. And I feel like once that is set and the opening ceremony has happened, there's a whole nother shift and experience that starts to unfold that really is the magic that works itself. I find that the less or the more that I share breath work, the less that I have to do, because everyone does their own work, and the magic of the space just works itself. But obviously, a space needs to have a strong holder of the container to set the framework for our work to be done. And so I feel like what you're speaking to is really about the container, and I would hand that over to the experience that I've had of the many beautiful ceremonialists in my life that have shaped who I've become, and whether it's the many years of Sweat Lodge or the different ceremonial leaders in my community in Mexico, all the way to the wedding ceremony and those rites of passage that were held for me when I was getting in my own way. There was people in my life that were really good at showing me where I was getting in the way, and also how to drop down on my knees and pray. We were experiencing a sweat lodge with my brother Wolf, who's Lakota, down in Mexico once, and we had a whole bunch of people show up, and he just comes down once a year or so, and he felt like it was a bit of a spectator sport that day, because maybe he was feeling a lack of intent or the depth, and what people were bringing. He likes to have a conversation with each individual as they bring tobacco to him before we go into the lodge. And he said to everyone just really blatantly, I hope we're not coming to have a Native American experience here today, because we're going in there to pray. And Meagan was speaking to this nature of performance or performance that can happen in our lives where we don't have much experience of the power of ceremony and ritual because it's been taken away from us. It wasn't that long ago that our very First Nations, people, the first peoples of this land, were told that their very ceremonies were illegal. And so it's sacred to them. And therefore, because we've taken so much from them in this part of the world, they haven't been that open to share with white.
But how can someone that's new to this how can ritual help us integrate life's peak experiences? So they're separate questions, but a little bit related.
If it's all right, I'm going to start with the second one, because Robin and Jazmin were both bringing up some things in my mind that we talk about these peak experiences, and that's typically when we think we need ceremony or we have ceremony at our fingertips. And for me, it's almost, if you think of the peaks and the valleys, what about the valleys? What are the ceremonies we have when we're in those valleys? I've worked with women who had abortions 30 years ago, and we created a ceremony now, 30 years later, to acknowledge their experience and the guilt and shame, and also the acceptance that they needed. And we look at these times in our life when the shadow work Robin was talking about, these things that show up in our lives that we fail to recognize and acknowledge along the way, and they stick to us. We carry them with us. In hearing both Jazmin and Robin's stories around birth, that wasn't my birth experience. I had pretty severe placenta previa. I would have died in traditional ways of childbirth. And so I knew from early on, after 3 miscarriages, that my 4th pregnancy would be a cesarean section. And wrapping my mind around that, and the anger and the fear and all of these things that I felt. And my daughter just turned 7, and I realized I was carrying some of those stories with me still. And so I created a birth closing ceremony on her birth date, 7 years later. We went down to the beach and we found this big gnarly looking piece of red sea kelp. And I told her about my placenta, and I told her about how this was blocking her way out. And she kept saying things like, I don't want to have babies. I don't want my tummy cut open. And really simple things, but that narrative was sticking to her. And I hadn't done my own kind of shadow work and really accepting that my birth story wasn't the way that I thought it would be. It didn't call in this power to myself. It was actually quite the opposite. I felt very vulnerable and very, very alone and isolated through that experience. And so 7 years later, to go down to the beach with her and create a ceremony around this was our birth story. And Let's accept it for what it was. Let's look at it from different perspectives, and let's reclaim it and make it ours, because at the end of the day, it brought us together. So we threw the red kelp into the ocean and had a swim together. And out there, we ended up finding this really long piece of sea kelp that reminded me of this umbilical cord that connected us. And so we both carried it as we swam back in. And it was phenomenal. It was us doing that work together. Kids are naturally ceremonial. She doesn't need much explanation. Robin was saying, both my daughters just, they find a dead bee in the garden, and I look over and I say, "What are you doing?" They're like, "Oh, we're just doing a ritual. We're saying goodbye to the bee." And they're creating this little kind of moment with that bee to thank it for all that it does in our planet and our world and our garden. So these lulls, these kind of valleys, I worked with somebody who was having an organ transplant, and she wanted to create a ceremony to say goodbye to her liver before the transplant took place, and also to welcome the organ of somebody else that would now be in her body. And she was feeling very mixed emotions around that, right? There was this conflict. So we created a ceremony to acknowledge that conflict and give her that support system, so that when she came out of her
beautiful, and that's a place where
her transplant and
Robin
continued on with her
Jazmin
healing and
for
recovery
sharing.
journey, she would know that she had looked
Robin,
it in its eyes and acknowledged what was there. And a ceremony isn't meant to fix things. It's not like we don't go down to the beach each week and share our grief and suddenly we're not grieving. That's not how it works. The intention for me is about witnessing and acknowledging and bringing voice to it. But yeah, those seemingly invisible moments are the things that I think we need more ritual and ceremony in, the things that we don't naturally gravitate toward. And then your question around where do we start? Simple. I think that people try to take on too much. We get into that. We get caught in that performative act of what things should look like rather than what they should feel like. We have certain expectations, whether they're internal or external, around who should be part of the ceremony or when it should take place. And we have all these pressures that we put on ourselves. So my invitation to people is just to really break it down into that key word, that key intention, and find something simple that they can do to start. I always say that being ceremonial is like building your muscles. You have to build these ritual muscles. And if you can build them every day, when something big, scary, traumatic, wonderful happens, you already have those rituals to draw from. That muscle memory is right there for you. And I think that's what we're all talking about. Life as a ceremony, this idea that how do we start bringing simple micro ceremonies into our everyday, so that when we do die, which we all will, there's no escaping it. Like, how do we look back on our life and feel like we're able to have a good death, a ceremonial death, if that's what we're given, if that's what we receive? How do we bring ceremony into that final chapter? It's hard to go from zero to that at the end. So it's really about, Stephen Jenkinson talks about, the only way to die wise is to live wise. Like, how are you bringing wisdom into your daily life? So that's, if you feel big and scary, and if it feels like it's not too much, then I always just tell people, just light a candle, take a moment and reflect, drink your cup of water, do so slowly, notice, what's happening inside your body, what's happening inside your head, and try to connect the two.
Thank you. Breathwave.net. I'm Robin Breathwave on my profiles on the gram of Instas. And we just love bringing people together in Breath Circle, whether it's in facilitator training. The level 1 is just a deep dive for yourself. And a lot of people are called to learn to hold space for others. And it's been a long, gradual, evolutional process of where we're at today with a very well-rounded training program that's based on international standards. And we're just about to get credited by the IBF. And it's a really fun space to be in, to see people holding space for each other. And I think the breath is so intrinsic that it touches us differently. So that's my focus, other than the family container and building a village. I've been really supporting the Revillager app lately, but my friends that are next door to us, who are basically yeah, looking at how we can create village and community, whether you're in the city or you're buying a piece of land and planting some seeds in the ground right now. But we do have 10 acres and we're eventually creating our own ceremonial space. And so I'll plant that seed in prayer as well. Thanks for having me.
People can find me on Facebook under Jazmin Pirozek. And you can also email me, jasminpirozek@gmail.com. Maybe you could, I don't know, write it just because it's difficult to write. JZMinpirozek@gmail.com. And a lot of people just connect with me to go on barefoot medicine walks, or for me to help them carry them through a particular ceremony like birthing or going through grief. Is a lot of the time people connecting with me, and for the psychedelic plant world as well.
Yeah, so my personal work as a ceremonialist and doula and celebrant is at Seeking Ceremony across all channels, and the Be Ceremonial app that my husband and I have built. We're also about to launch the Be Ceremonial Village, so an online space to be able to take courses and connect and have these special ritual rooms, whether they're around pregnancy loss or death and dying and grief and loss, and how we can start to really learn from each other and create space to be in community, because that's when these cultural shifts will truly start to happen, is when we feel that we're seen and heard and witnessed and also inspired by each other's stories. So I'm at the heart of the work that I do is storytelling, and that's my passion and my background. So thank you for having me, and it was lovely to meet everybody.
Yay, thanks for having me.